Well, it is 10 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Rain Gardens in Coastal Georgia workshop. My name is Kayla Clark, and I will be your moderator today, and I coordinate public programs for UGA Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant. So as an organization, we contribute to healthy coastal ecosystems through research, education, and extension. So we're excited that today you're going to get to talk about rain gardens, which definitely help improve our coastal water quality and communities as well. And your two instructors today will be Stormwater Specialist Jessica Brown and EcoScapess Program Manager Karen Giavingo. And so we'll turn it over to them in just a minute, but I did want to give you an overview of our outline and agenda for today. I'm just going to go over some quick Zoom logistics to help the morning run smoothly. And then I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to talk about stormwater and why have a rain garden. We'll have a little bit of a stretch break and Q&A session. She'll dive deeper into rain garden basics. We'll have a little bit longer of a break / Q&A, and then we'll turn it over to Karen to talk about plant guidance. Have some questions for Karen and then some wrap up about next steps. And Karen and Jess will talk more about this, but our goal is that by the end of the workshop, you'll have kind of what you need to know in terms of next steps for actually implementing a rain garden at your site. It's a lot of content to fill in 2 hours. I've seen them do a whole weekend workshop on this, so you're getting the condensed 2-hour but still substance-full morning version. So with that being said, we are going to still take Q&A during these breaks just to make sure that we fit everything in. But if you need to step away during those to grab water, use the restroom, please take care of yourselves during the 2 hours. We are recording it, so don't feel like you need to write down notes on everything. Usually about a week after the live program, we will post the recording to our public YouTube page. You will notice that your video and sound are turned off. So if you're familiar with Zoom meetings, webinar is a little different in that we won't see or hear you, but we still want to get your questions and we still want to include you in the discussions. So the two ways that you can do that are through our Q&A box and our chat box. So depending on your device, you'll either want to look at the bottom or the top of your screen, and you'll see the letters Q&A. If you click on that, that's where you can type in your questions, and then we'll take those during those break periods. And then the chat is where we will ask questions of you, and you can respond there as well. If you're on a phone or a smaller device, you may need to look for the word more or 3 dots. And if you click on that, you'll see a drop down that includes the chat function as well. So if you have any troubleshooting questions throughout, please feel free to put that in the chat and I can help you troubleshoot it. But otherwise, we've got a lot of great content to go over. And so we're going to dive right in and I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to get started.
Good morning. Thanks, Kayla. Welcome, everyone. So excited that you all are spending a little bit of time with us here on Saturday morning and learning some more about rain gardens. A few other kind of overarching details about the program today and some of the content that we're sharing. I hope that many of you received your reminder email that included links to a couple of things. One, a pre-workshop survey, and we'd love to have your feedback on that. So if you want to take a quick minute and search for that and fill it out if you haven't already, it's just 2 questions. But more importantly, it also included a link. There's a link here on the screen for our Rain Gardens in Coastal Georgia guide. And Karen and I are going to be touching on a lot of the content, but as Kayla already alluded to, we have a relatively short time together today, and so there's going to be some more detail included in that guide. And we'll try to do our best to reference some of those pieces, but you might want to have a copy handy as you continue to explore what might work in your landscape. And last, but certainly not least, is a very important piece to note. This entire project, the guide, the content for the webinar today, all that has been financed through a grant, in part from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and that's been facilitated through our Georgia Department of Natural Resources and their Environmental Protection Division. So we really appreciate them as a partner and are excited to get to share this content with you all today. So the next 10 slides or so, we're going to be talking about the why you might want a rain garden, why they're important, and some of the things that you might want to think about when considering whether or not your property is suitable for this type of application. And then we're going to transition into learning a little bit more about rain gardens and applying what we learn specifically at your home or a business that you might run. I noticed we did have a lot of folks that are local to the coastal region, and the content does focus on specifics for the coast. But if you're a little bit further up in the watershed, there's still a lot of this that will apply to you. You may just need to reach out to us for some additional information and specifics. So with that, let's get started. Let's think about what happens when it rains. So where does all the water go? There's actually a couple of different options. So you'll see as the slide progresses that it has the opportunity to be absorbed by plants. It can be infiltrated into the soil. It has the opportunity to evapotranspirate or evaporate from different various surfaces. But all the water that can't actually be absorbed, that water runs off, which is a great illustration of the concept of stormwater. So stormwater very basically is any kind of precipitation, rain, snow, sleet. Most often in the coastal region, we think about rain because we get a whole lot more of that. But that quantity of water that can't be absorbed or infiltrated back into the ground is what we're calling stormwater. And there's a few examples here. You've all experienced if you've walked across the parking lot at Target after a rainstorm, it's just enough to soak your shoes, or it may even be as severe as an event like this one here in the middle, where the park is completely flooded out as a result of these events. And some of the reasons that we are concerned about stormwater is all of this water actually flows downhill. It moves across the landscape, and as it flows across the landscape, there's essentially two kind of challenges that present themselves. The first of which is that quantity of water. So I gave a couple of other examples. These are a little bit more extreme, but they're the ones that we hear about on the news when we have storm events that cause flooding in our homes or roads to be impacted. And then that flooding can also lead to harmful environmental impacts such as algal blooms, or you can see this other picture of sediment plumes and hypoxia in the Gulf. But in addition to quantity, we also have concerns about the pollution, this non-point source pollution that can affect the quality of the water as it moves across the landscape. So when that stormwater moves, it has the chance to pick up the pet waste that we failed to pick up, or fertilizers or other kind of sources of nutrients that fall on surfaces that don't utilize them. Metals, oils, and greases, sediment. The list goes on for the things that the stormwater can actually pick up and move. So how did we get here? Over time, stormwater has become a little bit more of a popular topic because we've altered the landscape. So if you look kind of starting on the left-hand side of your screen, that undeveloped landscape, about 90% of the water was either being infiltrated and absorbed in the ground, or it was being evapotranspirated and used by the plants returning to the atmosphere. Only about 10% of it was running off. But as we have developed our landscape even more, we see that water balance change. And now over half of it, maybe even more in some of our more high density and urban clusters in our cities, we're actually seeing more of that water running off. And this may actually be the case in your own home as you've added a patio or a pool or a house addition. There may have been a reduction in the amount of the landscape that can actually absorb and infiltrate that water. And so we look to solutions that mimic that natural hydrology, the one that copies that less developed landscape before. And the science really points us to use some of the same materials, soils and vegetation. And these are all types of practices that we use to manage stormwater. And it's often called stormwater green infrastructure, or just simply green infrastructure. There are literally hundreds of different types. And today we're really just focusing on one, with the focus being rain gardens. So a rain garden is a shallow landscape depression that captures, filters, and allows the stormwater to soak back into the ground. It is a green infrastructure practice that's sized for a little bit smaller application. So much of our green infrastructure is really targeted to be place-based, meaning we want to treat it wherever that the source of the stormwater is. But rain gardens are kind of the miniature version. They're the ones that are really targeted some of those smaller applications. And as the definition says, it's a shallow structure that allows you to capture and temporarily store, usually between 48, 72 hours, and filter that water, filter it through the soils, filter it through the plants and the other media that you include, and allow it to soak back into the ground. And certainly shouldn't miss the fact that they can be really quite beautiful. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself there. Here in a few minutes, we're going to talk a little bit more about placement. But because we've talked some about impervious surfaces, things like buildings and roads and those surfaces that don't allow the water to infiltrate or be absorbed, I wanted to share the graphic here on the left. So you can see we're on the left here, we're actually capturing the stormwater runoff, in this case from a building, but it could also be a road or other impervious surface. And we're intercepting that stormwater with a rain garden before it's on its way to the nearest water body. And I've often, when sharing this graphic with a little bit younger audience, one of the first questions is, wait a minute, Jess, that's not a water body. That's a grate. That's in the middle of the road. And you're right. The water that actually goes into storm sewers, so those grates in our street or even some of our larger canals and ditches, it's important to note that water isn't treated. Those pipes, those conveyances actually just zip that on to the nearest marsh, the nearest ocean, the nearest lake or river. So this is just one way that we can clean up that stormwater, so to speak, and remove some of the impacts of degraded water quality before we send it on its way. There are a whole host of benefits. We actually dedicate a couple of pages to this in the guide that we've shared. You can see some here on the screen. But for me, anytime we're making an investment, whether that's buying new shoes for my family or lunch or a project that we're actually undertaking in our own home, it's always a good practice to think about what benefits you might receive. And so I'm not going to read them off. You can see many of them on the screen. And I've already touched on some of the environmental benefits, but and Karen's going to share more, quite a bit more when we're discussing about some of the benefits from vegetation. But I wanted to point out that they can also be very cost-effective landscape additions. So when you think about the cost of watering your landscape or the other practices that you're putting in place that hit your textbook, these rain gardens can be cost-effective and really, really quite pretty additions. So I wanted to take a minute to pause right before we go into the break, and maybe you can add a few things into the chat. What are some of the things that you've already started thinking about for your own landscape? What might you consider when thinking about a rain garden and stormwater on your property? And so we're going to take a little pause here and let folks put some answers into the chat.
And we'll give folks just a second to get those answers in, but you'll notice that in the chat box, we also put the question as well, so you can put your responses there.
Thanks, Kayla.
So one person wrote, our house doesn't have gutters to direct rainwater to drain pipe off the roof. Other folks put in elevation and slope. Where is the low point in my yard? Using a gutter to feed and installing that. Thinking about whether or not the soil will percolate, and homeowners association constrictions.
Those are all excellent points. And I've taken a couple of notes. I think several of them we're going to talk about, but make sure y'all keep me true to my word. We will make sure to hit on all of those. But those are all really good things to go ahead and start to think about. So with that, as Kayla promised earlier, we are going to take a little bit of a break. This is a good time to grab that second cup of coffee or use the restroom if you need to. And if there's any questions, we'll go ahead and address some of that. Before we jump into how big the rain garden might be and where you might actually want to put it, some of those things that folks have already started to think about. If you do happen to step away from your screen, we're gonna come back. My clock says 10:18, so let's come back no later than 10:23 if you do happen to step away.
Wonderful, thank you, Jessica. And we did have a question come in. Will it hurt a rain garden if it also catches wastewater from a salt system pool?
That's a really good question. So I will let Karen talk about the impacts that that might have on the vegetation. But from the soils perspective and the rest of the construction of the rain garden, it just depends on how much. If you're redirecting all of the wastewater from a saltwater pool system, you could over time actually see some deposits and an increase in the concentration in that area. But there are these systems are designed to handle even the filtration of some compounds like that you would see in a saltwater system. So if it was only a fraction of that, it could do a pretty good job of mitigating for some of the impacts.
And a follow-up question from a different participant was, for that, couldn't you select salt-tolerant species?
I'm gonna wait and let Karen decide if she wants to jump into this or if she wants to wait and cover that in a little bit. Karen?
Sure. I will be mentioning it briefly in my presentation. I want to also note that because we are in a coastal habitats here, and several of you may be close to brackish or saltwater conditions, the table that I'm going to talk about that's provided in the guidance document, the handbook you all have, actually provides for the 70 so species that are in the table for consideration rain garden use. I also provided salt tolerance, whether it's none or the variance of salt tolerance of individual species. So that will hopefully be a big help to you if you're in that type of situation.
And we will be having a public program in April all about saltwater tolerant plants that Karen will be teaching. So it's not up on our website yet, but keep an eye out for that. I believe that April 19th, Karen? I think you're on mute.
I believe that's the right date. So look forward to seeing perhaps some of you then.
We don't have any more questions at the moment, but I'm curious for any of you that are still at your computer and haven't taken a break, if any of you currently garden or use native plants in your landscape already. You can put that in the chat box. It looks like we do have a number of folks that do. And have any of you visited a rain garden or seen one either in your neighborhood or in your local community? So it looks like a mix of yes and no for folks that have seen a rain garden in person. So I'll be excited for your next section, I think, Jessica.
Yeah, I think we're coming out on time to jump into that, and there'll be a handful of photos to get to share today, but I hope that there's an opportunity to visit one close by. All right. Well, I think that puts us back on time, and I want to be cognizant of that since we do have quite a jam-packed morning. And so, as I mentioned before, let's talk a little bit about many of the things that you all had already started thinking about. Where should the rain garden go? How big should it be? What sort of things should I be looking for? And one of the first things that I always want to encourage folks to do is to take a walk, preferably in the rain or shortly after it rains. This is actually a picture of my daughter Alice, and she's an expert at this already at the ripe age of 3. But spend a little bit of time in your neighborhood, in your yard, taking a walk around and looking at how the water moves across your landscape. And a couple of things that I would caution or have you look at when you're thinking about that, areas that serve as pinch points or that direct water or even channelize water after a rain. It is often important to look at what that path is and look at opportunities along the path, preferably closer to the start of where that water may be collecting, that would allow you to put a rain garden and intercept that a little bit earlier on. But if you do actually have a spot that holds water for a long period of time, if you have a puddle that is not in your driveway, like the one here in our road that Alice is playing in, but that actually is in your yard, that's not going to be the most suitable spot for a rain garden because, as I was talking about earlier, we really want this water to have the chance to make its way and infiltrate back into the ground. So we do want to store it, usually on the order of a few days, but we actually don't want to increase and create a nuisance for you by putting it in the wrong place or allowing that water to be there for a long period of time. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but definitely some of the things to think about when you're first taking that first walk. And as several other folks pointed out, and this is a good time on that walk to do that, is observe things like the slope. You certainly don't want to spend all of your time and effort siting a rain garden only to find out that the water runs in the opposite direction. And so that's a little bit more challenging in coastal Georgia, which is why I encourage folks to actually take a look when it's raining, because their surfaces are relatively flat. And so it's sometimes hard to observe how the water is moving. So it may actually mean that you're taking a couple of different walks and examining those surfaces in a little bit more detail. And I feel like I'm harping on it a little bit, but it's also important to make note of those impervious surfaces. I've already talked about rooftops, but driveways, pools, water doesn't actually infiltrate water. And so patios, anything that doesn't actually absorb that rainwater can be a source of stormwater. And so take special note of those impervious surfaces as well. As you're looking around, it's really important to start thinking about, too, how will the water enter and exit the system. And so thinking about water movement, and you can see one of the graphics from the guide here in the lower right, you can observe that water is moving from different directions based off the eaves of this home. And then once it actually makes it to the ground, the landscape is directing how that water is moving across and making its way to the rain garden. And someone pointed out before that they didn't have gutters and downspouts, and that's okay. That's actually pretty common here. And so you would actually just be looking at maybe some more linear systems, or creating your own sloped system to redirect water into, or to create an inlet into your rain garden. It's also really important to note that while these systems are designed to handle a lot of the rain, the typical summer afternoon showers that we get, our typical rain events, we do end up with storms that are going to be larger, and they're going to cause the rain garden to overflow. It's impractical, both from a cost and a manual labor standpoint, to build a system that's going to handle the entire quantity of water that you could experience in a storm. And so thinking about, on those chances that it does overflow, where does the water go? And many folks, like myself, are fine for that just to consider to allow that water to move across the rest of the landscape. But some may actually want to consider some devices like the ones on the left-hand side of the screen, which you can purchase at your local big box store, Lowe's or Home Depot, and redirect that overflow to another part of your yard. And I skipped over it a little bit. If you do happen to have gutters and downspouts, and you're thinking about that inlet and where the water might enter, for less than $10, you can also purchase this downspout diverter pictured here in the top right, which allows you to have a little bit more control in moving the direction of the system. Couple of other things to note when you're thinking about placement. You can see this graphic here on the left hand, that's it side, that's on your also on your guide. You want to make sure that the rain garden is at least 2 to 4 feet away from the foundation of any buildings that are around, including sheds. And for those of you that may not actually be in the coastal region, because we don't experience a lot of basements here due to our water table, but if you happen to be a little bit further up in the watershed, you want to make sure that we're at least 10 feet away, preferably a little bit more than that if you happen to have a basement. We want to make sure to steer clear of our septic tanks and septic drains. If you happen to be on a septic system, infiltrating water on top of those systems is never really a good idea. So we want to make sure that we provide quite a bit of buffer for our septic systems. We've already talked a little bit about slope and a few other things to note. Two of the big ones that I would call your attention to would be, the first of which would be to learn a little bit about the type of soils that you have on site and the soil composition. And you can do that a couple of different ways. The first of which that we encourage you to actually conduct a soil test. So to do that, my favorite option is to direct you to our colleagues with Cooperative Extension and their offices. UGA Extension has offices in every county. You can actually locate the nearest office using the website that's here on the screen and pick up a soil sample bag. You can see me holding one for a project in that top photo, and send off a small sample for a very small fee. I think the current rate right now for the standard test is $7. But you can send that off and learn a little bit more about the composition of your soil. We're going to give you a few tips on how to examine some of those properties on your own, but the soil sample really can provide some peace of mind when looking at the analysis, and they'll actually send you a printout of that analysis for your records. I certainly encourage you to take pictures of when you're doing that walk so that you can also remember and consider a lot of these other components to be looking for. And the last one, actually, it garners its own slide, but it's important to think about where your utilities are within the landscape. So these are things like your water line and sewer, if you happen to not be on a septic system, gas or electric. All of these utilities are underground at varying depths. Most of the main trunk lines for those are going to be located in the street, and you can see in the graphic here, they make their way across your lawn, and you may have a pretty good understanding of where these things are, especially if you were responsible in building the home or if you've been there for quite some time. But if you're like me and you've recently moved in, you may not know exactly where utilities are in your landscape. And so fortunately for us, there's actually a free to us program called Georgia 811. You can see lots of ways to utilize and make contact to this program and gain access to this information. Now, I will say they have a lot of resources to tell you, kind of step you through the process. But the first thing, and I brought a can with me today, the first thing that you would want to do is actually to get some white marking paint, because you're going to want to go out on your lawn or your area, any part of the area of your landscape that you're interested in, and mark it out in white. And so this is called inverted marking paint. It's about $3, $4 at Lowe's. It's got a little tip here. It works just like spray paint. And you can go out and mark your yard where you would like for them to locate utilities. And they'll actually come out and mark the utilities, and you'll get a sheet with the color-coded paint or flags that they also use for the mark out. This is a really great resource. It's in the past, it's been largely available to contractors and largely to our bigger industry and municipalities. So it's a great opportunity for you to learn about where those utilities are and how to avoid them, because nobody actually wants to hit those during any sort of construction. Another great resource. This is a great tool to use when you're potentially sending off that soil test, because you can use the soils from the hole that you dig to include in your soil test. But someone had mentioned in the chat earlier, how do I know about the infiltration rate or if my soil will actually perk? And this is a pretty simple test that you can do at home. But you want to dig a hole, usually about a foot deep. I always say about a shovel inch wide or a shovel width wide, 4 to 6 inches. You can also use a post hole digger and move it around a little bit. You just want to make sure that you have kind of a uniform hole. You want to fill that with water and saturate the soil, let it stand until all the water is drained out. And I would also caution you to do this in a relatively normal time. So in the case of here on the coast a couple of weeks ago, we had several days of rain. You wouldn't want to do this test right after several days of rain. Conversely, if we've been in a drought for a long time, the test will be a little less accurate. So try to do it in kind of normal condition times, but fill it up, allow all that water to drain into the soil. And once all that's drained out, refill it again so that the water is almost level, about a 1 inch from the top. And then you can take a ruler, or you can see here, I just dropped a tape measure into the hole that we're using here. And about every hour for the first 4 hours, but you want to check the depth of water and see how many inches of water has drained per hour. So you can look at that, those measurements and get roughly an average. And I encourage you to actually, if you have the availability, to look beyond 4 hours, but get an average of the infiltration rate of the soil in that area. It's a great idea to do this in the spot that you're thinking about where installing a rain garden, but you can also do it at multiple locations across your landscape to get an idea of just generally how your entire yard functions with regard to infiltration. We have a couple of other resources on our website, a couple of worksheets that I'm happy to share if with a little bit more detail if you've got questions about the infiltration, or a perk test, as it's sometimes called, short for percolation. And that rate is directly related to the type of soil. So we're going to talk more about that, but you'll start to see all of the pieces come together if you get the soil test. If you have really sandy soils, your infiltration rate is actually going to be higher. So 2 to 3 inches per hour is relatively common with sandy soils, whereas if your soils have more clay material, that infiltration rate is going to be less.
Hey, Jess, before you move on, we did have a question in the Q&A box. They were wondering, does the 2 to 4 feet away also apply to how far away from a home's main water line to put a rain garden?
That's an excellent question. Thanks, Kayla. I typically encourage, yes, to add that tolerance to any utilities that you might find. If you're on a smaller property, it may be difficult depending on where your utilities all come in, so or where your water lines and your electric and everything are. And so when the markout is performed, they will give you a tolerance zone for each utility. It's typically about 1.5 to 2 feet on either side of where they mark. And so the 2 to 4 foot rule is generally a really good rule, especially if you know where your water line currently exists, to stay off of that. The infiltrating water won't do anything to harm your water line. And it is pretty difficult to injure a water line with a shovel, but it's just a really good practice to make sure that you're not going to hit those when you're digging out the rain garden. I will say water lines are pretty safe with a shovel. However, irrigation lines, not so safe. And we have some personal experience with that. I can certainly share. My husband's had to repair a couple of irrigation lines for that very reason. So be aware of those too, even though that they won't be included in the markout. Great question. All right. So the next thing that you want to be examining and looking at is, we talked about identifying those impervious surfaces, and the next step will be to actually look at the drainage area. So what is the area that you're looking to capture runoff from? And so in the graphic we've shown here and through the example that I'm going to share here for the rest of the time this morning, we're really focusing on the rooftop of this house, but it could also be a driveway or any other impervious surface. But once we've identified that surface, we really want to break that surface down into some very basic shapes. And so you've seen this graphic a couple of times already. The front of the house has some tricky eaves and some complicated structure. And so we really want to focus more on basic shapes because the geometry is a lot easier to calculate and helps us to have a pretty accurate look at the drainage area. So for this example, you'll see I've really taken the opportunity to focus on this being a rectangle because the area of a rectangle is much easier to calculate. We would really need the lengths and the width of this total the total area. Now, we're not looking to capture the entire drainage area of the house, but it's helpful just to go ahead and measure both the length and the width, and then we can divide that in this case by 2 because we're looking at capturing about half of it. But there's a couple of different opportunities for you to measure lengths and widths. You can use house plans if you have them. Google Earth is also another great resource, particularly if you don't have a ton of tree cover. You can use Google Earth, log on and punch in your address, and they have a measuring tool that you can use to calculate lengths and widths, which is great for rooftops and driveways or any other impervious surface that you might be interested in. Or you can make it a family event and get your measuring tape, or calculate someone's pace and measure out the drainage area that you're interested in by walking it off. I mentioned early on that rain gardens are really targeted for these smaller scale applications, so homes and small businesses. And the ideal drainage for those systems is going to be between 300 and 1,000 square feet. It's not that you can't use a rain garden to treat larger drainage areas or smaller drainage areas, but most of the guidance that we're providing is going to hit somewhere between that range. And if you need to tailor the system to be to fit, you can consider either multiple rain garden systems or just contact a professional to help you to figure out what the sizing might actually need to be. And when you're looking at the drainage area, I always encourage that this is a great time to revisit the inlet and outlet possibilities. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit more in the example that I'm going to provide. But just be thinking about after you've had a chance to look at it in the rain, then once you're calculating, in this case, we could have put the rain garden over here on this corner of the house, or the area that it's actually shown in the picture. But that was based off of constraints for inlets and outlets, and that we wanted this system to overflow into the natural area here for the sake of example. All right, so this is a really popular question. It was actually several folks that filled out that pre-workshop survey, ask about sizing, and we provided a couple of tools that are helpful. And the 2 big things that I've already mentioned that you want to make sure to have kind of handy when you're thinking about the sizing of it is going to be the drainage area, which we just talked about, but also the soil type. And so the easiest way to have the confirmation of your soil type is from the soil test that I recommended. However, there are some resources both online and via our website that you can use to generally type that soil on your own when you're doing that infiltration test. But we're really looking at the major categories of sand, silt, and clay. And so clay, as you might already be aware, it has a much higher plasticity. It's very thick, and it's not very good at infiltrating the water. We don't actually have large deposits of clay in our coastal counties, but there are instances in which we have fill material that's been brought in that has a higher concentration of clay, or maybe even a clay lens that runs through a particular subset of property. So it's important to know actually what you're working with on site and not just assume that you have sand or another soil type based off of location. That conversely is true if you're further up in the watershed. It doesn't necessarily mean you're just going to have clay soils. But your soil type is going to be very important when you're thinking about the sizing of the system. Another thing that you can use as an indicator is that infiltration rate. So if you do end up doing an infiltration test, perk test, soils that perform or infiltrate usually between 1.5 generally fall within that more silty soil category, kind of in the middle. 2 inches and higher is going to typically indicate a higher sand fraction. And then things that are less than an inch an hour on average are usually a pretty good indicator of at least some increased clay content. So when we're thinking about sizing, you'll take the drainage area, which is that impervious area. You can see that featured in the blue column to the left of the chart. And then you will have your soil type or general soil type there kind of across the top of the chart here. And you will use those those identifiers to actually come up with the size of the rain garden. And so, for instance, if we look here, this 300 square foot drainage area, or that impervious cover, you'll note that the rain garden size that's used to treat that drainage area, or that volume of water, is much smaller than the 300 square foot. Even in a clay soil, we only need about 100 square feet of rain garden to treat the volume of water coming from 300 square feet of drainage. And so it's important to note that your system is going to be smaller than that of the area that you're treating generally. On the left-hand side, and there again, we go into a little bit more detail in the text, and I'm going to share an example here in just a minute, but you can see two cross sections or profiles of what your rain garden might look like. The one at the top is based off of a more sandy or silty soil type. It's going to be a total depth. You're going to dig about 9 inches on both of these systems, but the rain garden itself is going to be about 6 inches deep. And so what I mean by that is we're going to dig about 9 inches, and then we're going to have 2 to 3 inches of mulch after we get our planting in there. And there's going to be that depression is going to be made up of about 6 inches across the profile of the rain garden. In the lower example, it's a much shallower system. This is much more conducive when we have either borderline silty, but more so clay soil types. You're still going to be digging about 9 inches across that entire profile, but you may want to add some amendments such as sand or some organics that in addition to the mulch. And your depression area, that open space, is really only going to be about 3 inches of storage. So like I said, I'll show that in a few examples, but many of the photos that we've shared so far, you see them after the plants have really taken off and gotten established. So I wanted to show a few that are shortly after construction that are a little bit more indicative of those cross sections that I just showed. All of these, you can see we've got little itty bitty plant plugs in and mulch and some of the amendments and additions to them, but that's just to give you an idea. Each of these, I think, do a pretty good job of illustrating that there is that depression. There is going to be some open space that we'll use to be filled up with the water after a rain event. Oops. So there's a few few photo examples. And then before I turn things over to Karen, I thought it might be helpful for us to step through a sizing example. So when we're capturing this rooftop runoff, in our example here, we do actually have gutters. As I mentioned before, we can certainly step through an example that doesn't have gutters for you, but the length that we're operating with, you go ahead and assume that's about 90 feet. And this width over here is going to be about 22 feet. So our total rooftop area for this house is about average for homes here in the Brunswick area, but just shy of about 2,000 square feet, 1980 square feet when we multiply 90 by 22. Just letting everybody have a chance to follow that math. So we're going to be multiplying the 90 by the 22 to come up with just shy of about 2,000 square feet. In this example, we chose to illustrate that on the four corners of the house, we do have downspouts. And I apologize, I did notice in the graphic, the only one that we really picture is the one that we're going to use over here next to the rain garden. So we have four downspouts. And because we have four, one on each corner, it's safe to assume that about a quarter of that rooftop area flows to each downspout. Now, if your rooftop is not very simple, if it's very complex, that assumption may not hold. And so you may need some additional assistance determining what drainage areas actually go into that downspout. But for the sake of the example today, we're going to assume that about a quarter of the rooftop drains to each downspout. So if we take this 1980 number and divide it by 4, we're going to come up with roughly 500 square feet, 495 square feet of drainage area that we'd like to design for. So I put that as a reminder here at the top. We know, because we actually did our soil testing, that we have something that kind of falls right here in the middle in the silt category. And so if we were to use the chart, we pick 500 in the drainage area, and then kind of move over to the silt, we would actually need a rain garden that's around 125 square feet. And I realize that this, we're kind of moving through this and it's a little bit oversimplified, but I wanted you to have a reference example to go back to and as you're stepping through the guide, looking at your own home. So we're looking to design about 125 square feet based off of our hypothetical infiltration rate. It is silty soil, but it actually drained a little quicker. We actually had an average infiltration rate somewhere around 1.75 inches per hour. And so we don't need any of the amendments. But we are going to be cautious. We're looking at about 2 inches of mulch for a total storage depth instead of 6 inches, right around 7 inches, because remember, we want to actually dig out about 9 inches deep for our rain garden, and we've got 7 inches of storage. And I think I'm going to go ahead and move through the last question. I noticed there's a few in the chat or a few things popping up in the chat, but I want to go through how to build it, and then maybe we'll address those some during the break as well. But one of the, just like when we were talking about looking at our drainage areas, using very simple shapes to think about laying out or as a basic guide for our rain garden also makes it easier for us to ensure that they're the right size. And so as I encouraged before in your walk to kind of make a sketch of the property, you can revisit that and then think about, okay, well, based off of the slope, if I don't have gutters, maybe I'm more interested in this linear swale, or if I do have quite a bit of slope on site, this linear version, that long skinny rectangle here may be more attractive, or this is just right outside my kitchen bay window, and we were looking at something that would like to fit in the landscape that needs to be a little bit more circular in size. So if you want to have more of a circular shaped garden, you can use this basic guide of a square. For the other two, the kidney bean kind of shape, the linear, you can do the outline based off of different size rectangles. So for the sake of our example, our 125 square foot rain garden, let's just go ahead and say we're going to use we want a circular rain garden. So we're going to base that off of this inside square. And as I mentioned before, we want our rain garden to be about 125 square feet. Well, if you look on the chart, the medium-sized rain gardens, we don't have one that matches exactly 125 square feet. We have 100 and we have 200. So the 125 is relatively close to our rain garden, our size, that 10 by 10. But because ours is just a little bit bigger, instead of using a 10 by 10, we're actually going to want to use an 11 by 11, which is about 121 square feet for that total outline. There again, a couple of folks have already pointed out that that's still not the 125. So if we wanted to actually over design it a little bit, maybe we use a 12 by 12. You can play some with the dimensions based off of how that actually fits within your landscape. But it's also important to note that you are going to have some depression and some plants outside of that square. So we look, the 121 is really the area that's captured in part of that square. Couple other notes and things to consider when you build it. We have, again, kind of the 10 steps to installation in the guide, and that's a good reference. But it's also a really good time to, at this point, to ask yourself, okay, great, Jess, so we know the size of this thing and where I want to put it. How am I going to build it? Do you want to pay someone to help build it? Or is this a really good reason to like fire up the grill or order some pizza, invite friends and family over for some socially distanced rain garden construction? Those are some things that to think about when you are ready to move forward and actually make it happen. In addition to digging out this area, you need to be thinking about what tools you might need. What tools do you already have? You can accomplish a rain garden with pretty minimal shovels and rakes, but I've found that a lot of folks, if there's a rototiller available or a wheelbarrow, those can make this work go quite a bit more quickly. And so you may be looking at maximizing the use of the tools in a large part of the rest of the landscape. Karen's going to talk more about mulch and plants, but you want to make sure to have those materials around. I mentioned the soil amendments if you've got a little bit more clay system. But also be thinking about the decorative elements. I shared a couple of pictures earlier, folks that like to use rock around the inlets and outlets. And you can see my former colleague, Ben, here really protecting the outlet of this rain garden from erosion by using some riverstone, which can be some very attractive elements to add to your rain garden. So with that, I think, we're actually up to our next break. There was a lot of information there. It was passed on pretty quickly, but hopefully, as Kayla mentioned, you'll have this as a reference as well as the guide. And so we're going to take this opportunity. Karen's going to go ahead and queue up her slides, but please go ahead if you have additional questions. I think that there are a couple. Submit those via the Q&A or utilize the chat. But take this as an opportunity to stretch and use the restroom, and we'll make sure to return. Kayla, do you happen to have the time for when we need to return back?
I apologize. I do not off the top of my head. Well, it was a 10-minute break, but I think we might have been aiming to be back around 11, but I'm wondering if we want to extend it a little bit so folks have that break.
Yes, that sounds like a good idea. Based off the PowerPoint timing that I'm showing here, if we could be back around 7 or 8 after, that would be advantageous. Does that sound about right?
That sounds great. And did you want a few questions during this break as well?
Sure.
We did have a question about, I know we are super sandy here. How difficult is it to change soil type by adding to what I have, and how often would I need to add to it?
It's a good question and fairly common question. So you can add some amendments that will help for your planting success. And I'm going to, we may revisit that question after Karen has a chance to talk a little bit more. You don't have to add, for the function of the rain garden system, you don't have to add amendments in attempts to try to change your soil type. So you can work with pretty much any of them by changing the sizing of it, and that we can help you with that a little bit more if you once you get into the guide and actually looking at some of those numbers too. So it's not necessarily required. We can actually just look at how deep and how big the system will be to help with that.
Wonderful, thank you. And I know there was also a question about what percolation rate are you looking for to create a rain garden?
So the sandier, the better is good for treating a larger quantity of water. So if you do have so the infiltration rates associated with that, I think I mentioned before, anything over 1.5 inches an hour, 2 inches an hour, on average, because it is kind of the average that you're looking at with that infiltration rate, is going to be really great. Your rain garden is going to hold water for less than about 48 hours after a rain event, usually in the neighborhood of 24 to 36. Based off of stormwater design, we don't want the rain garden holding water more than 72 hours because once we get into the 4 and 5 day mark, you can actually encourage the production of nuisances such as mosquito larvae. You can create habitat that you don't want to have. And so in those clayier systems, if you have infiltration rates less than about 1/2 inch an hour, we really need to caution making that system very shallow and reducing the storage, maybe treating a little less drainage area. So anything above 1/2 inch an hour is pretty easy to apply a rain garden for a solution. Less than that, it gets a little bit more challenging. Not impossible, but challenging.
Great to know. And we also had a question continuing on the soil line of questions. Wouldn't a rain garden capture lightweight sediments along with water over time? And will the rain garden actually fill up with soil over time?
Very astute observation, and yes, it will. There's actually some really fascinating research out of the Mid-Atlantic area that they have actually been studying rain gardens for over 20 years, looking at this very thing in varying sediment conditions. So yes, you will actually see sediment that moves into your system, and that will reduce your capacity. I often use the example with our younger audiences. We want our rain gardens to be more like innies and not outies. So if you compare those to belly buttons, we do actually want them to have storage so that increased sediment can over time reduce the functionality of your system. Most of the time, you're not going to see substantial sediment accumulation that would cause you to have to redo your entire rain garden. They're even showing rates of them not filling up for 30, 40 years. And that's actually the longest that we've studied sediment in rain gardens. However, you may actually see some sediment accumulation right there at the inlet of your rain garden. And if that's the case, it's a pretty easy fix. You can take a shovel or a garden spade and move that out to allow the water to access the rest of your system. And sometimes, depending on your property, that might be something that you have to do once a year. So you can add that to your kind of spring lawn maintenance activities. But it's quite honestly a little bit less frequent in most cases, just depending on your sediment loads.
We also had another question. How do you create an overflow structure? Is there a pipe underground that goes to the structure?
That is, I'll see if I can't hit on that in just a few minutes. So yes, there are the overflow structures that I showed on the screen. Those are actually prefabricated. There are systems that you can purchase there again at your local big box hardware store. Those you can connect to a drainage pipe, either corrugated pipe that you can run out into the rest of either into a drainage pipe network within your lawn. I've even seen some of those run to sump pump systems or other kind of drainage features, or those can actually be placed in a rock well that has a little bit increased storage. So they don't necessarily have to go to a pipe, although a pipe is most common. The thing to be mindful of is where that pipe actually connects, because you're not going to be able to connect that pipe into some of the hard structure drainage. So like your storm drain that might be in the street, can't actually connect it to that. So you would have to connect it within drainage along your own landscape if it's at a residence. Now that's for a small business. That's a conversation you can have with the city and look at actually connecting that back in. In many cases, quite honestly, we found that for the residential applications, we get so few opportunities of overflow. If it's one of those type of rain events, you're likely not going to be using your landscape. And so it's not necessarily worth the cost of the installation of the overflow system. But that's also something that we can revisit and help design. We'll talk about some of those opportunities coming up.
Well, I think we have time for one more question. This one is to address the long-term maintenance of the rain garden, trapping TSS. Could a rain garden design mimic advanced pond stormwater design with a 4-bay area?
Yeah, also an excellent question. You could certainly add a 4-bay system, which for those of you that are not as familiar with some of those advanced stormwater design components, that's essentially a small settling basin or pool that you would add at the entrance specifically for the capture of sediment or other pollutants. It makes it a little bit easier to maintain. You could certainly add a small 4-bay system. A lot of folks have in residential applications use rock at the entrance of the system, either in a kind of in a 4-bay application that will prevent some of the erosion, but also make it so that your sediment is a little bit easier to clean out and manage. But yeah, a great point. You could certainly add a 4-bay to handle the sediment if you're in a high sediment load situation. All right, so I think it's time to turn things over and let Karen talk with us a little bit about plants.
Is everybody seeing the screen okay?
Yes, we are. That looks great.
Great. Well, the second part of the workshop, I'm going to be providing guidance on how you integrate plants into your coastal Georgia rain garden. Oh, can't go down.
Karen, you might just try the right arrow and see if that helps advance.
Not here. I'll just use this instead. There you go. Apologize here. So in my mind, it may be a little biased, but I feel like this is truly the time when the fun begins in your rain garden installation. For you that are gardeners, perhaps you agree with me that I see gardening and dealing with plants is truly an art form. So this is your opportunity to personally influence the canvas and what your rain garden is going to look like in your landscape. And by integrating those plants, you're really bringing your garden to life. So what are we working toward? What's the end result that we're getting to? Well, first of all, you want a rain garden that's functioning well and is managing your rainfall. You want to select plants that ultimately make you feel comfortable with the amount of maintenance it's going to require. And you also want to look at how you're going to provide beauty to both your landscape and your community. And I feel this is really important that you please recognize that you can make a difference. As Doug Tallamy said, quote, "It is now within the power of individual gardeners to do something that we all dream of doing to make a difference. And in this case, the difference will be to the future biodiversity, to the native plants and animals of North America and the ecosystems that sustain them." Wow. So you can make truly a difference in our coastal natural resources and our coastal communities. So during my time frame, I'm going to be spending a lot of time talking about the role of native plants in rain gardens, and in particular, plant selection, because it is such a critical component to the functionality of the rain garden system. And then I'll be highlighting plant purchasing, design, installation, and establishment and maintenance. There's a lot more information that we provide in the handbook, but due to the limitations of time, I felt that the selection process is possibly the most important component to dwell on. So when we talk about rain gardens, native plants are what are recommended. And I just kind of chose this photo of swamp milkweed that's in my backyard, and try to emphasize that your rain garden is really like a micro ecosystem. And for instance, even though we view native milkweeds as extremely important host plants for monarch or queen butterflies, they provide an ecosystem for many other living native animals as well, such as beneficial insects that provide natural pest control in your rain garden that ultimately reduces any need for chemical use that you obviously would not want to do for your rain garden that is truly filtering pesticides in order to clean and provide water quality that's ultimately going to our waterways. So what's a native plant? There's a lot of definitions out there. I like to kind of consider it as species that are indigenous to our area. They've evolved and formed these natural associations with habitats and other organisms in a specific given ecological community. And they're very highly recommended for rain gardens, as I mentioned before. There's a wide range of benefits that I can't really spend a lot of time on today, but I wanted to concentrate on their role specifically with rain gardens. And as I mentioned, they've evolved. So as they've evolved over these many, many years with the current animals that existed during their evolution, as well as the elements in those ecosystems, they're truly important they're truly integral to the ecosystems and their well-being and health. And ultimately, and as Jess kind of mentioned before, practically, landscaping with natives can provide a more simple, lower maintenance, and cost-effective way, while you are able to actually mimic natural ecosystems in the area, lost habitats that are being challenged due to development and invasive species in our area, while you're also providing those water quality benefits. And one thing I find about native plants is they, in general, have these extremely deep and extensive root systems. And I provided this photo for you to look at. If you look on the extreme left-hand side, I've circled a non-native plant that's actually uses turf further north, Kentucky bluegrass. And as you can see, the limitations of the root systems of that particular plant. Whereas the diagram provides a wide range of different native prairie plants, and you can really see the incredible extensiveness of the root systems, which really allow them to survive in high drought conditions. They have more drought tolerant possibilities and tendencies. The roots help them to remove the pollutants. Boy, they can help with keeping weeds at bay in your rain garden. And the soil has more of a capacity to store the water that you're trying to collect and filter. So ultimately, you're dealing with prevention of soil erosion, fertile soils that help to keep your plants healthy, as well as ultimately reducing that stormwater runoff and flooding. And we are so lucky in coastal Georgia because we just have a beautiful and vast array of native plants. And these, as I mentioned before, they also evolved. And they're particularly have adopted to our extreme conditions here on the coast, our sunlight, our temperatures, our waters, our salts, our soils. They've developed resistance to natural pests and diseases, but they are an important component for herbivore food sources. A very important role is you have to select the right plant for the right site conditions, and I'm going to go into that in a lot more detail. But once you've watered them and they're established, you truly are not worried as much about watering. There's usually minimal watering needs, and you do not apply any synthetic fertilizers or pesticides, of course, in the rain garden, but also by using native plants anywhere in your landscape, you're being able to really minimize any influence on non-point source pollution that will ultimately go into the coastal waterways. And practically, because using native plants, they tend to be resilient and thrive, you're going to spend less money in the need for replacing or maintaining them. And I guess ultimately, part of the beauty of rain gardens is the plants themselves, but also who they draw in. You know, if you plant it, they will come. And so this slide really gives you an ideal of just a small percentage of the living native animals that depend on these native plants have evolved together, that depend on them for their food or for their nesting or for their shelter. So let's get into the nitty-gritty. Plant selection. It's really critical component, essential component of the rain gardens. You have to concentrate and spend some time on appropriately selecting and ultimately installing your plants that match the rain garden, hydric soils and conditions, as well as the soil and sun conditions. And to do that, you will ultimately be able to obtain a successful rain garden. And I like to kind of point out three basic components of plant selection. And the first one I'll address is Rain garden plants need to tolerate the climate conditions and extremes of our region and your site. And the beauty of native plants is that you can look at what we call here on the left an eco region map of Georgia. And I have circled the coastal area of Georgia, lower coastal plain of Georgia. And we actually live in what is considered the southern coastal plain ecoregion. And the beauty of knowing this ecoregion, you're automatically going to have a knowledge base and resource of what kind of plants in the plant communities that have evolved here are indigenous to here. And it also really provides information on the soils and the landforms and the really complex biological relationships that occur in the ecoregion. Now, some of you, if you haven't actually worked with native plants before, you may be more aware of the USDA NRCS plant hardiness zone map. And I encourage you to use the ecoregion map when you're dealing with native plants for the reasons I mentioned. The plant hardiness zone map really provides average winter low temperatures, and that's best for use with exotic and ornamental plants. Another extreme component living on the coast is the influence of salt, whether it's salt water, inundation, whether it's salt spray, etc., that could greatly impact the plants that you have planted in that area. And so if your rain garden happens to be near brackish or saltwater habitat, you're going to want to look for plants that tolerate salt. And I will get into that a little bit more related to the table that's provided in the guidelines. But this is just a smidgen of an example of some beautiful native plants that we have to choose for salt tolerant habitats. The second bare basic for plant selection is kind of taking care of a myth that I believe many people have regarding rain garden plants. People hear rain garden, they think, oh, wetland plants, something that needs to stay in water all the time. And that actually is not true for a successful rain garden plant. You want to find plants that withstand periods of both inundation, flooding, and drought. Because as you can think of in terms of our coastal situations, we do have rain events, stormwater events, but we also have dry, sunny periods as well. And that plays a big role in your rain garden plant selections. So if you look at a bird's eye view of this very quickly, that center portion of the rain garden is part of the most flood-prone portion of your hydric zones of the rain garden. This is where the plants are definitely going to be dealing with flooding, and they need to tolerate wetter conditions. The zone 2 is more in the slope area, and they're more likely going to be exposed to some standing water and moisture, but drier conditions in zone 1. Zone 3 is going to be on the outer edge and will prefer drier conditions. So basically, you're trying to identify individual plant species that are appropriate for specific hydric zones of your rain garden based on how they tolerate moisture in the soils. So if we look at the lowest zone again here, on the bottom zone, you need to find plants that can tolerate really wet, saturated soils for a certain time frame and flooding, but also can thrive in between rain garden events in dry and drought conditions. And I'll tell you, the native plants that you use in the bottom hydric zone really provides an example of the beauty of native plants and the extreme abilities of their tolerance of different conditions in our coastal environment. And in the middle zone, again, that slope. Okay, so it's going to be periodically moist or saturated, during those stormwater events for a little bit of time. but they're going to also have to thrive between rain events under those dry and drought conditions. They will be drier than that bottom condition. And they may be taller plants than what you provide from what's in the outer zone. Let me get into that a little bit. So the outer zone here, it's really an upland area. It's not considered a functional component of the rain garden. And you really think about drought tolerant plants here. No need for them to be really concerned about anticipated flooding conditions, etc. So if you look at the broader picture of the rain garden, you have a wonderful diversity of native plant species to consider for these 3 different zones. So let's take a little quiz. I got 2 little quizzes here. Based on what you've just heard, some people say, oh, I remember seeing this just absolutely beautiful, bright red, scarlet red native plant that I saw in a rain garden. And I know it's a hummingbird magnet. Okay, that's great. Well, we actually have 2 native plant species in coastal Georgia that fit that definition. So my question to you is, let's look at these 2 species and you tell me which one is the right plant to pick. Okay, on the left, we have the cardinal flower. Absolutely beautiful, stunning plant. It's a lot of people's favorite, likes partial shade of full sun, moist to wet soils, can tolerate flooding briefly, but can't tolerate dry conditions for a very long period of time. Versus on the right, you have scarlet sage. Full sun to part shade is best in dry to moist soils, does not tolerate flooding, is tolerant to drought and heat. Which species should we choose for the bottom zone of the rain garden? Anyone to share? If you picked cardinal flower, you were right. Okay, let's try one more. Here's rush and grass, common rush and purple lovegrass. Okay, so the common rush, it's full sun to part shade, wet to moist conditions, soil conditions, tolerates flooding and standing water, and is best typically in more moist soils. Versus the lovegrass, needs full sun, moist to dry, is drought tolerant, but does not tolerate standing water. Which species would you choose for either the slope zone, medium zone, or the 3rd upland zone of your rain garden?
You can put your responses in the chat if you have a thought one way or the other. We did have a few people, Karen, that guessed cardinal correctly on the last one.
Great. Okay. So if you chose purple lovegrass, you give yourself 100%. So I just want to give you a very simple examples of what you want to be asking yourself while you're selecting plants for your rain garden. The 3rd one is where appropriate, and depending on the size of your garden, you want to include a mixture of trees, shrubs, and herbaceous materials, meaning grasses and perennials. And I just very quickly just want to share with you the beauty, the complexity, the variety in textures and colors and form that are rain garden plants that are appropriate here in coastal Georgia. So here we have a few slides that cover more native herbaceous forbs. And just look at the absolute beauty and form and textures that you can look forward to researching and investigating to consider for your rain garden. Just lovely. Just beautiful. I'll talk about on the top right, turkey tangle frog fruit. I think it's my favorite native plant name for around here. And they can play a very important role in rain gardens. But let's look outside of those flowering herbaceous perennials we tend to think of in rain gardens. We have so much more to look forward to in terms of consideration for our rain gardens, namely grasses, Now, grasses, they serve many different roles in a rain garden, but they first provide a beautiful variation throughout the growing season, as well as fall and winter interest. They can be host plants for butterflies and moths. They provide food and shelter for wildlife. And one interesting thing for rain gardens is that they, just through their natural ways and natural plant communities, they've evolved to grow amidst some of these other flowering perennials and provide naturally a support for those perennials so that you can avoid any kind of staking. And here's just a sample, some large versus smaller grasses and a rush, just beautiful, that you can consider in your future rain garden. And if you're lucky enough to have shady rain gardens, ferns are just a beautiful addition, and they really provide a wonderful contrast to the flowering plants. So that's something to consider. Here you go. If you have that type of sun condition. And then if you've done your calculations and determined the appropriate size of your rain garden, as Jess is so well provided on and so on, and you determine that, wow, I might be able to choose to have a larger garden. You may choose to have several smaller ones instead, but let's just say, hypothetically, say you're shooting for the larger garden. Oh boy, it's a wonderful thing when you have that option, because you can provide so much greater diversity of the plant choices that you selected. You can even be thinking of small trees and even larger shade trees, if possible, in that larger size. So let's just talk about shrubs first. You can provide shrubs in smaller rain gardens as well, with mature sizing if permits. And I will provide you a beautiful array and selection of small to quite large shrubs that occur naturally here, and provide so many benefits. Now, I did want to point out that a few of those treasured larger native shrubs for rain gardens actually sucker. Coastal pepperbush and inkberry. And these are really great to have in larger rain gardens where you can allow that suckering characteristic that they have to actually allow them to expand a little bit while reducing your need to weed. And here's another array, an example of some of the native shrubs that you can consider in the rain garden. Now, these are all going to be provided in the handbook that you've been provided today, and I'll get into that a little bit further. Another wonderful consideration are our native palms. Our saw palmetto is considered one of the highest priority pollinator magnets in our coastal plain area. So they provide not only that evergreen and unique texture and look about them, but provide wonderful assistance for our pollinators and beneficial insects. And then with the larger rain garden, you can really think about the trees. And you can be considering both small as well as large trees in larger rain garden components. And I fell in love with this award-winning rain garden just from several years ago, where they actually converted, do you see this, the lawn, the turf? They actually converted the rain garden into more of a woodland rain garden component that emanated the existing habitat just adjacent to what had been the turf. Just a beautiful way to incorporate and enhance and further the buffering of that existing native habitat while providing that water quality, stormwater benefit. One thing you may want to consider that smaller trees may be more appropriate when you're dealing with smaller suburban settings relative to the scale of their size. And this is just a flavor of several of the eastern redbud and beautiful fringe tree, or the larger pond cypress or river birch that you could consider. And pond cypress is a tree that I feel is just really underutilized here in coastal Georgia. It's a little unique to the bald cypress in that it doesn't have the tendency to develop those knees in the upland situations. It's a very tall, beautiful tree that actually sheds its leaves in the fall, provides that fall color, but it's narrow. And you can even consider application of this in some of those smaller suburban settings. Now, some other considerations in plant selection. Oh boy, this is a biggie. Mature size. That top slide, you surely do not want that kind of challenge in your ultimate mature rain garden due to not considering mature size. So let's look down at the bottom two slides. So on the left, it's just an example of sand cord grass. It's one of the wonderful native plants you may want to consider that also has salt tolerant capabilities. But this is how you may actually be buying your sand cord grass. It might be in 4-inch pots. And I know there are many 4-inch pots there in that photo, but you get an idea of what you're buying at that time. Versus on the right side, this is a mature sand grass, cord grass example of two plants that can ultimately be of a 3 to 6 width and height expansion. So please take that in consideration when you're choosing your plants. Another plant consideration, this is where your art really comes to play. Think about that year-round interest. What about fall and winter color? What about evergreens versus deciduous? What about these gorgeous seed pods and fruits that can occur throughout the winter, fall seasons, and foliage shapes and textures? This is where the fun really is. This is where the experimenting comes in. And the more diverse your plant site is, the more diverse of the actual native animals that you draw in. So, okay, Karen, you told me all the selection criteria, but goodness, how do I even start selecting plants for my rain garden? Well, our handbook provides guidance on the plant selection, design, installation, establishment, and maintenance that I'm discussing today, but also developed an Appendix B. It's just 76 nursery available native plant species that I specifically selected for the handbook that are appropriate for coastal Georgia. And in that appendix, there's a table that provides individual species profiles and characteristics. So let me just give you a little example. In Appendix B, this is just a screenshot. It's not complete, but there is at the beginning definitions and explanations of what different components of the table that is provided. So for instance, hydric zones on the left-hand portion of this slide explains the bottom, middle, and outer zone, as well as, let's say on the right, some of you may not have heard or are aware of what's a National Wetland Indicator status. And I explain what these designations may mean for the different species in the table. For instance, what's the likelihood that a plant's going to be found in a wetland or an upland? And that also will help you select the appropriate placing of the plant in the rain garden. So here we go. This is the first part of the table of the Appendix B, and this is specifically grasses and rushes. And so if you look from the left to the right of the table, you're provided the scientific and common name, and please always use the scientific name when you're searching out native plants for purchasing. Sometimes there are many different common names to not just one, but several different plants. And having the scientific name will define what the nurseryman will provide to you. I also provided examples for each species of where best to place that specific species in the hydric zones of the rain garden. Next, whether it's deciduous or evergreen, the sun exposure that the plant performs best in. And then mature size, please make sure you consider that in your selection process, as well as bloom color, bloom time, because you really are trying to shoot for blooming throughout the entire growing season. And if you're one of those people that may be impacted by salt conditions here on the coast, there's salt tolerance levels, there's the wetland indicator level I mentioned, as well as each individual species that provide additional plant characteristics that may help you. We also provide photos of each of the species that's represented in the table and where they're found in the table. So hopefully this will give you a little bit more information to assist in your process. Now, I just want to very quickly mention that there are several other native plant selection tools. First one is the UGA EcoScapes Georgia Native Plant Search Engine. And it does have a component, a selection of rain garden here. However, the search engine does not provide the actual information of a hydric zone use for the individual plant, but it will provide you more brevity in searching out additional species. Another option is a Rain Garden smartphone app. It's a free national app, and it provides statewide lists of plants, native plants that are appropriate for rain gardens in Georgia. When you've selected your plants and you're ready to purchase them, you want to be seeking out reputable native nurseries and growers that have actually propagated and grown the plants there at the site. And it's very important that you buy native plants based on ecoregions. And I'll, as we discussed a little bit, we want you to be considering purchasing of an individual species that is sourced from the coastal plain. Let's say, for example, you're saying, oh, I love the American beautyberry, Karen. I want to get a beautyberry. And hypothetically, you find that there's some beautyberries up in the Atlanta area. And you're saying at a native nursery, that's wonderful. And you're trying to find other locations, you find out that, there's a native nursery in Jacksonville that carries that species as well. Where should you be buying that plant? Well, if you're down here in coastal Georgia, you'd be seeking out purchasing from the native nursery here in our ecoregion, which would be the Jacksonville nursery. And there are also some additional UGA EcoScapes publications. That information, all this will be provided to you later after the fact of the workshop. But there are two separate publications I want to mention called Purchasing Native Plants, Considerations and Nursery Sources, where I basically provide both retail and wholesale native nurseries within the coastal plain of Georgia, as well as North Florida and South Carolina. And there's another publication I think you could find helpful. It's called Points to Live By When Shopping and Gardening with Native Plants. So now I'm just going to move on to some highlights in the next components of plant integration with rain gardens. And we're going to start with design. Now, this is where it's really fun. There's a lot of different ways you can consider design for your rain garden. And some of the more, I guess, apparent or popular ways is what we call traditional formal, whereby you see a lot of symmetry, a lot of linear applications versus a naturalistic application, which you're just trying to provide a little bit less of the formality in your landscape versus naturalized down at the bottom, whether it's a meadow or forest that you might be trying to exemplify, and that is a much more random type of application of the plants. So if we look at the top two a little bit in more detail, this top figure represents more of a traditional planting design. As you see, it's linear in design. And you can really see the formal symmetry and application of the spacing and choice of the plant selections. Each of these plants are provided in an odd numbered type of situation. And you see that repetition of those same clumped individual plant species that provide that formality. And it's nice because we're provided both a bird's eye view as well as a side human view of the application of that type of design. And then below that, at the bottom, it's an example of more of a naturalistic planting design. It's still where you're going to find the ideal of the symmetry in planting in odd numbers. But as you see, it's in a sloped format, more of a curved format that emanates more of what you may find out in nature. Regarding installation and establishment, I'm just going to hit on some of what I think are some of the key components to consider. And as mentioned before, you can refer to the handbook for other additional information. But when you're about to install your rain garden, first of all, you want to make sure that your plants are watered. You want to keep plants moist in those containers until you're actually planting them, and that will assist in successful establishment. But lay out the plants and actually space them out. Make sure that the design that you came up on paper is being appropriately applied when you're setting down the containers. But this is also the time where you may want to correct what you had designed on paper and make some adjustments as needed. You want to dig holes that are twice as wide as the plant and deep enough so that for everything outside of large trees and shrubs, you want to keep the crown level with the existing grade. And this photo provides an example of how you can make sure that that grade is level. However, when you're planting any trees or large shrubs, you want them just a tad above the grade, and that will help with the appropriate drainage as well as the establishment of the larger plants. Watering is critical. There is a thought sometimes people say, well, it's a native plant. I'm just going to stick it in the hole and I'll walk away. Well, actually, native plants are like any other plant, and they do need their roots to be watered so that they can be established effectively. Concentrate on those roots, and you want to water the plants immediately after you've planted. Now, for the herbaceous perennials and the grasses, watering may take just several weeks to a month or so to feel that they're doing well and they're becoming established. However, the small tree shrub roots, they're going to be watered. They're going to need to be watered for at least the first, if not the second growing season to make sure that they're established correctly. And when it comes to fertilization with native plants, fertilization of native plants with synthetic fertilizers is not appropriate. It's not recommended. It's completely unnecessary. So save your money there. If you feel that the soil conditions are such that you feel there needs to be a little bit of assistance with their establishment, then you might want to provide a little bit of organic compost top dressing. And you need to make sure that top dressing is something that will not float away during a stormwater event. Now, when it comes to mulch, I'm really trying to emphasize an alternative that I am currently still trying to seek out myself and experiment with in our landscapes here. There's a thinking of what we call green mulch It's actually an herbaceous layer or ground cover that you use instead of what we think of traditional mulch. And these ground cover layers, they don't float. They're not going to flow away with the stormwater. They even provide even greater opportunity to capture and hold the water for the rain garden and interception, as well as maybe provide some evapotranspiration. And they provide this lush, thick ground cover. It's just aesthetically pleasing. It just provides character, another application of character to your landscape. And I want you to consider that, if possible, when you are installing a rain garden. I gave 2 examples. The Virginia strawberry. This is, of course, something that if it wasn't in the rain garden area, it would be considered edible. I wouldn't recommend that relative to the role of the rain garden itself, but they need moist to dry conditions, and they're an evergreen, and they're spread by runners, so they can do a wonderful job of spreading out. This is maybe something that you might want to address more at the top part of a slope out into the upland area. Another one, I mentioned the turkey tangle frog fruit. Boy, I love that name. They're more in wet to moist to moderately dry conditions, and it's an evergreen as well. And these are wonderful because they can form really dense mats. They spread by nodes, not by runners. They have some salt tolerance, and they're an incredibly important pollinator nectar source for the smaller pollinators. Now, I did want to mention before I get into maintenance, I have quite a bit of information regarding the more traditional mulch in the actual handbook. And I just want to mention a few, and please refer to the handbook for more information. I see a lot of dyed mulches being used in our area, and it's usually recycled wood and may consist of treated lumber. And one of the things you're concerned about is not using them. I don't suggest using them in your landscape, period, but especially in the rain garden because they contain chromium, copper, and arsenic. And I just wanted to bring that to your attention. That can really have an impact on contamination of the soils that affect the wonderful beneficial soil of macroinvertebrates, the insects, earthworms, etc. So the other information on the mulch is something that I think is readily available and easy to understand, such as trying to avoid cypress mulch. The cypress mulch, they tend to include some of our native bald cypress and pond cypresses that I mentioned, and they are 2 species that are critical to our wetland ecosystems. So that's just an example of some of the mulches to avoid. Now, traditional mulch does play a role in rain gardens, and there is further information on the very thin layer of mulch that is necessary for the rain garden itself. And I encourage you to look at that in further detail. And last, but very importantly, rain gardens need maintenance. And again, I provide more information in the handbook, but let me just make pointers of some of the maintenance components that I think are more obviously things that you probably have to be confronting in your installation and ultimate maintenance. So first of all, weeding. Weeding is an important component in the maintenance of your rain garden. In the experience I have, weeding is really important, especially in that first year when you have the younger plants and you may have more bare soils, which allow the possibility of a volunteer unwanted plant species in there. And so providing that good plant cover is really important, but you're dealing with plants that have not matured yet. And it's just an essential thing, especially in those first few months. You may want to put, if you're not real familiar with the way your plants look, you may want to take pictures of them. in their younger form, you may want to provide tags beside the plants so that you know what ultimately is a weed and what is the desired plant. In addition, pruning may be necessary. Now, when I look at trees as well as the shrubs, if you've truly planted in mind with mature size, height, and width, that type of pruning should be very minimal. But there's other types of pruning that may be necessary, such as removing dead, dying, crossing branches, broken branches, diseased branches, or if there's any hazard that's been perceived based on the placement of the plant in the rain garden. That may be necessary, but otherwise, my hope is that the pruning would be very limited. Now, when it comes to perennials down on that right left-hand corner, try to keep, if possible, your perennial growth and the seeds, et cetera, throughout the winter and early spring for the birds to feed on, as well as some of these hollow stems within the herbaceous perennials are very important overwintering sites for the beneficial insects, the bugs that are providing predator or parasitoid components in your rain garden. And these guys you want to have around because they're preying on those pests you don't want around. So try as much as possible to keep those stems in there until early spring. And then you can prune them, cut within a few inches of the ground. So that's basically what I have for today. I have so much more I want to share, but within the time frame, I hope that I was able to provide some of the more higher priority identifications as you consider the potential of installing a rain garden in your landscape. And I wish you the very best in that endeavor.
Thank you so much, Karen, for all of that information. And I know some of our folks have also added that to the chat that they found this really helpful. We are a little short on time and we want to make sure that we let everyone get out in time for lunch. So if you do have more questions, still go ahead and put them in the chat because I'll save that and we'll follow up by email if there's ones that we don't get to. There has been one that I did want to ask verbally before we move to our wrap up. But do we treat native plants in rain gardens the same as native plants in other places in yard? So I know you talked about watering until they're established, but once they're established, basically, do they need to water them in between rains?
No, I mean, if the plant species been sited in the right site conditions, unless we're in an extreme lengthy drought situation, that is where the exception to the rule may apply. And in those situations, I really recommend that you keep a real eye on your shrubs and trees in those type of situations, because they are the ones that could be impacted in the long term, much more so. So in general, no, if you site them the right way, you're fine and you shouldn't have to be considering too much more watering.
Awesome, thank you. And I know there's been a number of questions about how to access the handbook. So I am going to turn it over to Jessica to share some more resources and next steps for after this workshop if you are interested in continuing to investigate making your own rain garden. I would just ask that if you could please type your name in the chat box. We are taking attendance because this is a prerequisite for some of those incentives that Jess will talk about. So if you haven't done so already, go ahead and put your name and the name of anyone else that might be watching on a device with you in the chat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to wrap us up.
Perfect. Thanks, Kayla. Thanks, Karen. That was wonderful to get to hear a little bit more about those plants. And so as Kayla mentioned, please add your name, add the questions. We want to be mindful of time, but certainly want to not miss the opportunity to tell you about some opportunities that are coming up. And so hopefully by now you all are excited and thinking about what's next. And maybe that means that you want to consider a rain garden at your home. So let's talk a little bit more about what opportunities that might be available through this program. So Kayla already mentioned that to please put your name in the chat. There's also going to be an evaluation that comes shortly following. And we'd really appreciate it if you would fill that out. It helps us evaluate the webinar, what you liked, what you didn't. It helps us evaluate ourselves. But it also helps us make the case for future programming. And so part of the reason that we received this grant and are able to offer this workshop, as well as some of the opportunities coming up is due to some of that participation. So please participate in that. But that kind of leads us to the next step. In the next couple of weeks, everyone that signed up to participate in the webinar today will receive an email, and we are going to be conducting a pilot version of our Coastal Rain Garden program a little bit later this spring, April 2021. And what that means, you're going to get all the details in the email, but we're going to be inviting folks that are ready to move forward with their rain garden to sign up for a one-on-one design consultation and participate in the program this spring. And that, like I said, there will be more details in the email, but there will be an opportunity for you to meet, to gather some of the information that I talked about early on in the presentation, but meet with me and confirm some of the drainage areas and the sizing components, and then you'll have a chance to meet with Karen and take a deeper look at what some of plants might be considered in your rain garden, which ultimately may result in you being eligible for a stipend to receive or a refund to refund a portion of the cost of the rain garden should you choose to move forward with implementing it into your landscape. And lastly, if you're not ready to commit this spring, if you're just still kind of filtering through some of that information, it's okay. We are going to have yet another opportunity. You'll get an email later this summer as we're moving into the fall season to also be a part of some of those design sessions and potentially access the stipends to incentivize the addition of these rain gardens. That'll be really beneficial to coastal Georgia. So more details to come. As Kayla mentioned, this is kind of the prerequisite. So I see lots of folks adding things into the chat, which is great. Thank you again for being with us today. This last slide, you can follow along and learn more about what we're doing, kind of keep up with all the programs that Kayla's offering, the research that we're funding, just what we're up to in general. But if you're like me and later in the car today or in the shower, trying to catch a nap sometime later this week and you've got hit with a question, there's our follow-up contact information. Please be curious, send us an email, give us a call. We'll be happy to help connect you with whatever resources that you couldn't actually get your hands on this morning. So thanks again. Kayla, any last updates before we all sign off?
No, just that if you are interested in more events, you can also check out our event calendar or that website that's on there. You can get to all of those. So if you want more plants, Karen's got 2 more public programs coming up this spring, all about native plants and landscape with them. And with that, I think unless you all have anything else, we'll let you get to your lunch and the rest of your Saturday.
Thanks, y'all, for coming. Thanks for your time.